Are you afraid to die? It's something we all think about from time to time, right? The inevitability of it, the unknown, the mystery of what happens when our time finally comes. Most of us would probably like to think that when we go, it'll be peaceful, without drama, without tragedy. But the truth is, not everyone gets that luxury. Death can be sudden, violent, and sometimes it can leave questions unanswered, especially when it comes to the how and why. It's not uncommon in certain cultures and belief systems for people to say that when someone dies tragically, their spirit doesn't just move on. Instead, it lingers around, often because of unfinished business, a need for closure, or maybe even a desperate desire for justice. They say it's like the soul can't rest until something is set right, until the wrongs of their death are corrected. And that's exactly what we are going to talk about today. Hi, I'm Ethan, your host, and welcome to Necronotes, where I talk about the creepy, the mysterious, and all the weird stuff I find online. Today's story is another wild one, and it's a special shout out to Unded for suggesting this topic. Thank you so very much. Now let's head over to Virginia, specifically Greenbrier. Greenbrier is a quiet suburban community in Fairfax County, tucked between Fairfax City and Chantilly. Established back in the late 1960s by Levitt and Sons, it has that classic planned neighborhood feel to it. Peaceful, clean, organized, almost too organized actually. One of the quirks about Greenbrier is its oddly specific street naming pattern. Pretty much every road either starts with an M or a P, with one weird little exception, the Acorn Hill, which that one kind of slipped through in 1994 when they added 5 mansions to the area. There's even a theory floating around that the streets were named after the developer's kids. Not confirmed, but it's a fun bit of local trivia. Now, with all that said, something unusual happened in Greenbrier, something that still turns heads to this day. A murder case was solved with the help of a ghost. And no, that's not an exaggeration. A literal spirit played a role in putting someone behind bars. So let's talk about how this whole thing began, with a woman named Zona Hester. Now, Elva Zona Hester was born sometime around 1873 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. A small town girl from the Richlands area, not much is documented about her early life. She grew up at the foot of Little Sewell Mountain in a deeply religious household, with 4 brothers, and from what people could tell, she didn't stray far from home. There's very little about her that made headlines while she was alive. But ironically, it's not her life that made her unforgettable. It's what happened after. By 1895, Zona was around 21 or 22 and going through a rough time. She had given birth to a child out of wedlock, something that back then could completely wreck your reputation, especially in a small conservative community. The father, a man named George Wooldridge, was, let's just say, not exactly Father of the Year material. He had no money, no stability, and apparently wasn't even convinced the baby was his. Instead of stepping up, George dipped out, dodging both responsibility and the shotgun wedding that would have followed. Now imagine what that meant for Zona in that era. A young, unwed mother in a God-fearing town was basically gonna be the talk of the town. Whether she stayed with relatives for a while or simply laid low on her family's farm, we don't know for sure. But one thing is clear: life had gotten complicated. Her family, already struggling to make ends meet, now had another mouth to feed. And in a place like Greenbrier, reputations mattered, especially to her mother, Mary Jane Hester. Mary Jane was a tough woman, strong-willed, deeply religious, and the kind of mother who didn't take disgrace lightly. It likely fell on her to keep Zona's name from being dragged through the mud. Marrying her daughter off to someone respectable was probably the only way she could secure any sort of future for her. Zona, for her part, was beautiful and, according to some accounts, had a kind of intense energy about her. She wasn't meek, and it's possible she felt trapped by her circumstances, stuck in a rural life with little room to breathe. So, when a new face showed up in town, a man who wasn't from around there, who had a steady job and maybe a bit of mystery to him, it's easy to see how she might have been drawn to him. Enter Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe. Yep, that's his name. Most folks just called him Edward. He was a blacksmith, new to the area and trying to build a new life. He got a job working for James Cruikshanks at a shop just off the old Midland Trail. Back then, the roads were all dirt and horses were essential, so a blacksmith like Shu would have been in high demand. He was in his early 30s then, tall, strong, and people said he had a certain look about him, firm jaw, striking eyes, and a temper. There were also whispers that when he got angry, his eyes went pitch black. And unfortunately, Zona, for all her strong will and experience, was completely taken by him. Zona met him shortly after he settled in and they hit it off quickly. Despite everything she'd been through, there was something about this stranger that pulled her in. He had steady work, charm, and the kind of rough appeal that probably felt like the total opposite of the men she'd known before. And within a few months, the two were married. But not everyone was thrilled. In fact, Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester, had a bad feeling about Shu from the start. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she was convinced he was hiding something. And she wasn't wrong. But we can talk about that later. So, in November of 1896, Zona and Edward were married at the Methodist Church over in Livesey's Mill. They moved into a modest two-story home that had once belonged to the town's founding family, the Liveseys. It was likely rented to them through Cruikshank's family connection, so it's possible Shu had managed to convince them he was respectable enough. Life seemed to settle for the couple. They set up their home in Richlands, not far from where Zona grew up. Her cousins were nearby, and she was still close enough to visit her family if she wanted. Everything looked normal. A hardworking husband, a loyal wife. On the outside, they seemed like any other couple trying to make things work in a quiet corner of West Virginia. Then, something happened on January 23, 1897 that would change everything. That day was the unfaithful day that Zona Shu's body was discovered inside her home. The story starts with a young boy named Andy Jones, whom Shu had sent on a little errand. He was supposed to run to the house and check if Zona needed anything from the store. It wasn't much of a task, but when Andy reached the house, what he found would set everything in motion. Zona was lying on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Her feet were together, one hand resting on her stomach and the other outstretched beside her. Her head was slightly turned to the side, her eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. Even a young boy could tell Zona was dead, so naturally the boy ran home. And the local doctor, Dr. George W. Knapp, was called to the scene. But there was a delay. He didn't arrive for nearly an hour, and by then, Shu had already moved his wife's body upstairs and placed her on the bed. Now here's where things get a little fishy. Shu, rather than leaving the body for the community's women to prepare as was customary, took it upon himself to dress Zona in her finest clothes. A high-necked dress, a veil over her face, and her body meticulously arranged. Dr. Knapp, when he finally arrived, gave her only a brief examination, but he noted bruising on her neck. As he tried to investigate further, Shu's reaction was so extreme that the doctor ended the examination right there. And so, Dr. Knapp recorded the cause of death as everlasting faint and later, childbirth. But Zona wasn't pregnant, and that diagnosis didn't sit right with anyone. Word spread fast. By late afternoon, two of Zona's friends volunteered to ride out and inform her family. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester, lived several miles away in a more secluded area called Meadow Bluff, and she was notified of her daughter's death. Upon hearing the news, her reaction was immediate. "The devil has killed her," she exclaimed. It was clear from the start she didn't trust Shu. She had never liked him, and now this? Something felt terribly off. The next day, January 24, Zona's body was moved to her parents' home. Her coffin, courtesy of a local undertaking business, was brought up the mountain, and Shu, still acting like the grieving husband, kept a vigil over the body. He refused to leave her side even during the wake. Shu's behavior grew increasingly erratic. At the wake, he was all over the place, switching between deep sorrow and bursts of manic energy. He wouldn't let anyone get near the coffin, especially not while he fussed over his wife's body. He placed a pillow on one side of her head and a rolled cloth on the other, explaining they were there to help Zona rest easier. Then he tied a scarf around her neck, tearfully saying it was her favorite. But as people gathered to pay their respects, they couldn't help but notice something wasn't right. Zona's head seemed loose. It wasn't normal. This unsettling behavior didn't sit well with many of the people who attended the wake, so they began to talk. After the wake, Mary Jane Hester, the mother, took a sheet from inside the coffin to return it to Shu. When she unfolded it, she noticed something strange. The sheet had a peculiar smell. She washed it, but when she dropped it in a basin, the water turned red. The stain in the fabric turned pink and then faded, but it didn't wash out. The eerie bloodstains only confirmed what Mary Jane already believed. Her daughter had been murdered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had happened. That's when she turned to prayer. Night after night, she prayed, asking for her daughter's spirit to return and reveal the truth about what had really happened. And according to the legend, her prayers were answered. For 4 nights, Mary Jane's daughter were disturbed by the spirit of her daughter. Zona's ghost appeared in the form of a bright light, then took shape. Zona's spirit would tell her mother over and over that Shu had killed her. He had attacked her in a fit of rage, all because she hadn't cooked meat for dinner. In his fury, he had broken her neck. And to prove it, Zona's ghost twisted her head completely around, backwards, showing the horrific injury. At last, Mary Jane knew the truth. Her daughter hadn't died of natural causes. She had been murdered by the man she had once trusted with her life. A short time after Zona's death, Mary Jane Hester, convinced that her daughter's death was not natural, sought out the local prosecutor, John Alfred Preston. She hoped to convince him to reopen the investigation, presenting the visits from her daughter's spirit as evidence of a miscarriage of justice. Preston, known for his politeness and sympathy, spent several hours with Mrs. Hester. By the end of their meeting, he agreed to take action. Deputies were dispatched to speak with Dr. Knapp, the attending physician, and others involved in the case. Although it seemed unlikely that Preston would reopen the case based solely on claims of ghostly visitations, the investigation was revived. Preston, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, traveled to Richlands to meet with Dr. Knapp. During their conversation, Knapp admitted that his examination of Zona's body had been incomplete, suggesting that an autopsy might shed more light on the situation. The two agreed that performing an autopsy would either confirm or dispel lingering doubts surrounding Zona's death. It would also help clear the name of her husband, Trout Shu, if he were indeed innocent. A few days later, an exhumation was ordered. A jury was assembled, and the autopsy was set to take place in a local schoolhouse, just a short distance from the Seoul Methodist Church graveyard. As the autopsy took place, a jury of 5 men watched closely, along with several officers of the court and a handful of spectators. The first step in the autopsy was a careful examination of the vital organs, but the doctor didn't seem to look much further. A quick inspection revealed what they had feared. Zona's neck had indeed been broken. It revealed that Zona's neck had been dislocated between the first and second vertebrae, and her windpipe had been crushed. There were clear marks on her neck that indicated she had been strangled. The public was shocked by the revelation, and the evidence against Trout Shu began to mount. He was arrested and charged with murder, though his defense remained adamant that there was no conclusive proof linking him to the crime. Despite the circumstantial nature of the evidence, Shu was indicted by a grand jury and pleaded not guilty. As Shu awaited his trial, more details about his past began to emerge, painting a troubling picture. And it turns out, Zona was his third wife, and his previous marriages had ended in controversy. His first wife had filed for divorce, accusing him of abuse, while his second wife had died under mysterious circumstances. The death of Lucy Ann Tritt, his second wife, had been suspicious. Shu claimed that she had fallen and struck her head on a rock, but many believed this explanation was unlikely. After her death, Shu had quickly moved to Greenbrier County in the autumn of 1896. While in jail, Shu maintained a strange attitude. He seemed unaffected by the gravity of the situation, even suggesting that his goal in life was to have 7 wives. He dismissed the charges against him, claiming that his guilt couldn't be proven. The trial began in June 1897, with numerous witnesses testifying against Shu. But it was Mary Jane Hester's testimony that truly stood out. Preston, eager to portray her as credible, made sure she appeared sane and reliable in the witness stand. He avoided the subject of her ghostly visions, knowing they would be seen as inadmissible and could undermine her credibility. But the defense, perhaps trying to discredit her, asked Mary Jane about her visions, putting her ghost story front and center. They attempted to paint her as an irrational mother, but Mary Jane held firm in her testimony, never wavering in her belief that she had seen her daughter's ghost. The defense's attempt to belittle her only seemed to reinforce the belief that she had seen something supernatural. As a result, the jury was heavily influenced by her testimony. Despite Shu's own eloquent defense, the jury quickly reached a verdict: guilty. 10 of the jurors even voted for the death penalty. Although the verdict was not unanimous, Shu was sentenced to life in prison. However, not everyone in the community was satisfied with the verdict. On July 11, a group of citizens, armed and determined, set out to lynch Shu. But thanks to a man named George M. Hara, who contacted the sheriff, the mob was stopped before they could carry out their plan. Shu was relocated to the West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville, where he spent the next 3 years. He died there in March 1900s, likely due to one of the epidemics that swept through the prison that spring. As for Mary Jane Hester, she lived for many more years, continuing to share her story until her death in 1916. She never recanted her belief that her daughter's spirit had played a role in uncovering the truth about her murder. As for Zona's ghost, she was never seen again, but her legacy lived on in Greenbrier County. A roadside marker still stands today along Route 60, commemorating the case and the remarkable story of a mother's love and determination. And that wraps up today's episode. I hope you enjoyed listening about the eerie and unforgettable tale of Zona Hester and the trial that made history. Big thanks once again to Unded for suggesting this fascinating case. If you like this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. I've got plenty more strange, twisted, and chilling episodes lined up, and I'd love for you to be here for all of them. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I will catch you in the next episode. Stay curious, stay safe, and as always, keep an eye out for the unusual. Bye!